Hey friends, welcome to Unpolished but Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer. And today we're talking about growth, but not the kind that lives in nice phrases or inspirational quotes that sound good, but don't actually tell us much about what's happening in real life. Today we're talking about the kind of growth we only really recognize when we look back and realize we don't respond to life the way we used to. When something in us feels steadier, less reactive, less frantic, even if we can't point to a single moment when it happened. Because when faith grows, it doesn't just live in what we believe intellectually, it reshapes how we move through our days. It shows up in conversations, in the way we handle stress, in the decisions we make when no one else is watching, in the tone of our inner dialogue. And sometimes we miss it because we're expecting something louder or more dramatic, like a visible milestone, when in reality, most of the change happens quietly through repetition, through learning, 1,000 small choices that slowly reshape the way we live. So today, we're going to slow down and look at what actually changes. No spiritual cliches or vague leveling up, just real life shifts that tend to happen as faith deepens and becomes something we live from instead of something we're constantly trying to reach. So one of the clearest ways we can tell something is changing inside us is in how we react to life. Reactions are honest in a way almost nothing else is. They don't wait for us to be wise. They don't wait for us to be prayed up, caffeinated, emotionally regulated, or in a good mood. They just show up fast, loud, and they tend to reveal what's really living under the surface. That's why reactions are often the first place growth becomes visible. Because it's one thing to believe something in theory, and it's another thing to embody it when life pokes us in the ribs on a random Tuesday. Most of us can name a season where our reactions felt like the whole story. If we felt hurt, the hurt wrote the script for the entire conversation. If we felt anxious, the anxiety decided what was urgent, what was dangerous, what had to be solved immediately. If we felt frustrated, the frustration didn't just stay inside, it traveled straight into our tone, posture, words, and sometimes into the rest of our day like a little emotional glitter bomb we didn't mean to throw, but somehow did anyways. We weren't trying to be reactive, we just living at the speed of whatever emotion arrived first. And emotions are persuasive. They didn't say, here's some information. They say, here is the truth, and you should act accordingly right now. When faith begins to grow, one of the first changes is not that we stop feeling those emotions. Growth does not turn us into peaceful statues who never get rattled by anything. Growth is not spiritual numbness. Growth is that we begin to develop space, a pause, a breath, a tiny moment where we notice what we feel before we obey it. That space is small at first, and it's easy to underestimate it, but it's also where our whole life starts to shift because space creates choice. And once we have a choice, we can start responding instead of reacting. This is where we notice that the first feeling is rarely the whole picture. We might feel irritation, but underneath it, we might be tired, feel anger, but underneath We might be scared, feel defensive. But underneath it, we might be embarrassed, feel anxious. But if we go in underneath that, we might be carrying too much, keeping too many plates spinning, expecting ourselves to be the strong one in every room. When faith is shallow or mostly theoretical, we don't always catch those layers. We just feel the top emotion and we run with it. As faith grows, we start noticing the layers. And that alone makes us steadier because now we're not just reacting to the surface, we're paying attention to what's actually going on. We start seeing this in the small, almost boring moments. And honestly, that's a good sign. It's not just in the big crisis where we suddenly become heroic and calm. It's in the everyday friction that used to set us off. Someone cuts us off in traffic, and we still get annoyed, but we don't let it ruin the next hour. A text message feels short, and we still feel the sting of, did I do something wrong? But we don't immediately spiral it into a full internal investigation like we're the FBI of feelings. Someone disagrees with us, and we still feel that hot flash of wanting to defend ourselves. But we pause long enough to hear what's being said before we gear up for battle. Those are the moments where growth shows up, because they are the moments where we used to be on autopilot. That pause starts changing the way we speak. We might catch ourselves mid-sentence and adjust. We might choose to lower our voice instead of raising it. Ask a question instead of making a statement. We might say, give me a second, which feels very unspiritual until we realize it is actually wisdom. Sometimes the most mature thing we can do is buy ourselves 10 seconds so we don't say something that takes 10 days to clean up. Faith grows. Growth looks like learning the art of the holy pause. We also notice growth in how quickly we come back to center after we do react. Because we will, even with growth, we will have moments where we snap. We get sarcastic, we shut down, we get petty in our head and then act like we're fine. Growth doesn't erase that, but growth changes the recovery time. There was probably a time when one messy moment would spiral into shame, and shame would turn into distance, and distance would turn into, I guess I'm just like this, and that would turn into more mess. The day would become a pileup. As faith grows, we don't stay lost in that spiral as long. We're able to notice what happened, own it faster, and return to clarity sooner. And that is real progress. And it's a kind of progress we often don't celebrate because it's not flashy, but it's deeply practical. Think about how different it feels to recover quickly. We don't have to replay the conversation for 6 hours. We don't have to punish ourselves for being human. We don't have to turn one bad moment into a story about our entire character. We can say, that wasn't my best. And then we can do the next right thing. We can apologize sooner. Reset. We can stop digging the hole deeper. And that alone changes our relationships because the people around us don't just experience our reaction. They also experience our repair. And repair builds trust. It tells people, we are safe enough to be honest here. And it tells us too. Another sign that faith is growing is that defensiveness starts losing its grip. When we are insecure, everything feels personal. Feedback feels like condemnation. Disagreement feels like rejection. A tone in someone's voice feels like a verdict. We spend a lot of energy trying to protect ourselves from being seen as wrong, weak, foolish, or not enough. It's exhausting. And we often don't realize how exhausting until the defensiveness starts to loosen. Then suddenly we can breathe in conversations. As we grow, we don't need to win every exchange. We don't need to be right every time to feel okay. We can let someone have an opinion about us without that opinion becoming our identity. We can hear critique and sort it. We can take what's useful, leave what's not, and not collapse either way. And that's not arrogance, that's stability. It's the difference between being teachable and being fragile. Faith growth tends to make us more teachable because we don't feel like every correction threatens our worth. We also start responding differently to misunderstanding. Before growth, misunderstanding felt like an emergency. We had to fix it immediately. We had to clarify, explain, make sure the other person didn't walk away with the wrong impression. Because the wrong impression felt dangerous. As faith grows, we can tolerate being misunderstood without panicking. Not because we don't care, but because we trust that we don't have to manage everyone's perception of us in order to be okay. That's a big deal. That's freedom. Conflict changes too. Some of us default to avoid conflict because it feels scary. Some of us default to leaning into conflict because it feels like control. Either way, our reactions in conflict tend to be driven by fear. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being powerless. Being hurt. As faith deepens, conflict becomes less about fear and more about clarity. We don't have to avoid it, and we don't have to bulldoze through it. We can stay present, speak honestly without lighting the room on fire. We can listen without silently building a counter argument in our head. We can aim for understanding instead of dominance. And yes, sometimes we still mess that up. But even messing it up looks different when we're growing. Because we repair faster and we learn. A really practical sign of growth is that we become less allergic to discomfort. Not because discomfort is fun, it's not. But we stop treating discomfort like a sign that something is wrong with us or wrong with God. We can sit in an awkward conversation without needing to escape immediately. We can tolerate tension long enough to work through it. We can have hard feelings without trying to numb them instantly. Growth doesn't make life comfortable. It makes us steadier in discomfort. Uncertainty is another place this shows up. When faith is shallow or mainly conceptual, uncertainty feels like threat. We react to uncertainty with frantic planning, overthinking, doom scrolling, worst case scenarios, and that special kind of mental gymnastics where we try to predict every possible outcome so nothing can surprise us. Spoiler, life still surprises us. As faith grows, uncertainty still feels uncomfortable, but we don't react to it with the same panic. We can admit, I don't know, without feeling like that makes us unsafe. We can make plans and still hold them loosely. We can take the next step without needing a full map. That is a form of trust. And trust is one of the most practical fruits of growing faith. This doesn't mean we become careless. We still think, plan, handle responsibilities, but the energy changes. We stop trying to control uncertainty through anxiety. We start accepting that we can be faithful without being certain. And that might be one of the most mature things we ever learn. Now here's a big one that doesn't get talked about enough. The way our reactions toward ourselves begin to change. This is often where the deepest growth happens. And it's also where we tend to be the least honest. Because we get used to being hard on ourselves and calling it being realistic. We tell ourselves that harshness keeps us accountable. We tell ourselves that grace will make us lazy. We tell ourselves that if we don't criticize ourselves, we'll never change. But what usually happens is the opposite. Harshness doesn't produce sustainable growth. It produces shame. And shame produces hiding, not transformation. As faith grows, our inner dialogue begins to soften. Not into excuses, but into honesty that's not violent. We start noticing when we speak to ourselves in ways we would never speak to a friend. We start noticing the tone of our thoughts, the quick verdicts, the "of course you messed that up," the "why can't you get it together? You should be past this by now." And when we notice it, we begin to challenge it. We begin to replace it with something truer, kinder. Begin to practice talking to ourselves the way God talks to us, with clarity and compassion, not condemnation and contempt. That shift is not small, and it changes everything. Because when the inside of our mind becomes a safer place to live, we stop reacting out of self-protection all the time. We stop needing to prove ourselves so desperately. We stop being so terrified of mistakes. And that makes us braver, steadier. It makes us more open to learning, less reactive in general. We also begin to notice that we can feel emotions without worshiping them. And that's a big one. When faith is young, emotions often feel like reality. If we feel distant from God, we assume God is distant. If we feel unloved, we assume we are unloved. If we feel like a failure, we assume we are a failure. As faith grows, we start remembering that feelings are real, but they are not always accurate. We can honor what we feel without letting it become our theology. We can say, "I feel anxious," and also, "this is not the whole truth." We can say, "I feel discouraged," and also, "I'm still held." And that double statement is maturity. It's the ability to hold emotions and truth at the same time. Another practical shift is that our reactions become less performative. Before growth, we might react not only from what we feel, but from what we think we're supposed to feel. We might force positivity because we think that's what faith looks like. We might hide grief because we think sadness is a spiritual failure. We might pretend we're fine because we don't want to look weak. As faith deepens, we become more honest. We can feel what we feel without the extra layer of shame. We can be human in front of God and in front of safe people. We stop confusing faith with pretending. We might also notice that our reactions become less extreme. We stop swinging as wildly between "everything is amazing" and "everything is ruined." We stop living on a dramatic emotional roller coaster where one good thing means we're thriving and one bad thing means the world is ending. We become more steady in the middle, And honestly, the middle is where most of life happens. The middle is where the dishes are. The middle is where the bills are. It's where the long workday is. It's where the ordinary Tuesday is. Growth faith helps us live well in the middle without needing constant emotional hype to feel okay. So, when we say growth changes our reactions, we're not saying we become calm robots. We're saying our reactions stop being the loudest authority in the room. We start noticing them, naming them, and then choosing what to do with them. We start repairing faster when we mess up. We start being less defensive, tolerating discomfort and uncertainty with more steadiness. Start talking to ourselves with more grace and truth. And we start holding emotions and reality together instead of letting feelings define the world. And that is not small. That is life-changing. And it often happens so quietly that we don't see it until we're in a situation where old us would have erupted or spiraled, shut down, and new us still feels the emotions, but chooses something different. And that moment can feel almost surprising, like we just discovered strength we didn't know we had. But it wasn't sudden, it was grown, practiced, it was formed over time. We'll even notice it in places like our phones, which honestly might be the most honest mirror we own. Before growth, one weird notification, unread message, a post that doesn't land the way we expected, our mood can flip like a light switch. We can go from fine to bothered in 2 seconds, and then we start reacting to everyone around us like they were the ones who left us unread. As faith grows, we start catching that pattern. We start realizing, wait, I'm not actually mad at my family. I'm just overstimulated and insecure, and my brain is trying to make it somebody's fault. That awareness sounds simple, but it's huge. Because now we can choose a different move. We can put the phone down, take a breath. We can stop feeding the spiral. We can say, this is not an emergency, and mean it. We can also start noticing that our reactions become more proportionate. Before everything could feel like a 5-alarm fire, a small inconvenience felt like proof the whole day was cursed. A minor misunderstanding felt like the relationship was doomed. A setback felt like the end of the story. As faith grows, we begin to scale things more accurately. We can still be disappointed without catastrophizing. We can still be annoyed without turning it into a personality trait. Still feel hurt without deciding we're unloved. That proportionality is maturity. The ability to feel something without inflating it into a prophecy. And sometimes growth looks like us learning our own triggers without being embarrassed about having them. Start recognizing the situations that make us reactive. When we're hungry, we're exhausted, we're caring too much also. When we feel rushed, unseen, juggling too many responsibilities. And then somebody asks one more thing of us, and we're suddenly ready to move to the mountains and live off berries. Faith growth doesn't magically remove those triggers, but it does help us notice them sooner. And when we notice them sooner, we can respond with wisdom instead of shame. We can say, I'm not okay right now, and I need a minute, instead of acting like we're fine until we explode and then feeling guilty afterwards. We also stop confusing intensity with righteousness, and that one is sneaky. Sometimes we think the strongest reaction must be the truest reaction. We assume that because we feel something strongly, it must be right. And anybody who doesn't agree must be wrong. But as faith grows, we realize intensity is not the same thing as accuracy. We can feel something strongly and still check it. We can say, this feels big to me, and also say, let me make sure I'm seeing this clearly. And that kind of humility is a sign of growth, and it saves us some much relational damage. So yes, when faith grows, our reactions change. They don't disappear, and they don't become perfect, but they become less controlling, dramatic, identity defining. But they do become something we can notice, name, and navigate. And that is the kind of growth we can actually feel in day-to-day life, because it shows up everywhere, in our tone, our pace, patience, our ability to repair, our willingness to pause, capacity to be honest, and our courage to choose the next right thing, even when we don't feel like it. And that's why this matters. Because faith growth is not just a private spiritual idea, it changes the way we move through the world. It changes the way we show up in relationship, the way we handle stress, the way we handle ourselves, the story our reactions are allowed to tell. And once we notice that shift, it naturally leads us into the next layer. Because when our reactions stop running the story, we begin to realize something else is changing too. What we chase, prioritize, and how stable we feel in who we are. And once we start noticing that our reactions don't get to run the entire story anymore, it naturally opens the door to another shift that's just as important, even if it's quieter. Because when we're no longer spending so much energy reacting, we begin to see more clearly what we're actually moving toward. Our priorities start to rearrange themselves, not because we're forcing change, but because clarity has a way of reshaping what feels important. There's usually a point where we realize that some of the things that used to feel urgent don't feel quite as urgent anymore. The need to prove ourselves, to keep up, to hit certain visible milestones, to be seen a certain way, it begins to loosen its grip. Not because we stop caring about growth or purpose, but because we start caring more about alignment than appearance. We start asking quieter questions like, does this actually matter? Or does it just feel loud? And that question alone can redirect a surprising amount of energy. We might notice we're less pulled into comparison. We still see what other people are doing, but it doesn't carry the same emotional charge. Their timeline doesn't feel like a verdict on ours. Their success doesn't feel like evidence that we're behind. We can appreciate, learn, celebrate even, without turning it into a measurement of our own worth. And that shift creates so much breathing room. Because comparison is one of the most exhausting mental habits we carry. And when it loosens, life feels lighter. As priorities shift, we also start becoming more intentional with our time. We don't feel the same pressure to say yes to everything. We're more comfortable protecting our energy, not out of selfishness, but out of clarity. We begin to understand that attention is one of our most valuable resources, and where we place it shapes the kind of life we're building. So we choose differently. We invest more in relationships that are life-giving, We step back from things that only drain. We learn that it's okay to not be everything to everyone. And then underneath all of that, something even deeper settles in. Our sense of identity becomes more stable. We stop redefining ourselves every time something goes well or poorly. A good day doesn't make us invincible, and a hard day doesn't unravel us. We begin to carry a steadier understanding of who we are, one that isn't constantly fluctuating based on circumstances or opinions or outcomes. That steadiness is quiet but powerful. It means we can take feedback without collapsing. We can celebrate wins without needing them to define us. We can experience setbacks without turning them into a narrative about our value. We become less performative and more present, less concerned with how we're perceived, and more focused on how we're actually living. Relationships tend to deepen in this season too, because we're not constantly trying to prove something. We show up differently. We listen more. We speak more honestly. We're less guarded. There's less pressure to maintain an image and more willingness to be real. And real connection grows in spaces where we don't feel like we have to pretend. We also begin to notice that we're more comfortable with imperfection, not because we've lowered our standards, but because we understand that growth is ongoing. We don't need every moment to confirm that we're doing it right. We can make mistakes, learn, adjust, and keep moving without letting those moments define the entire story. That kind of freedom makes us more resilient because our sense of self isn't so fragile anymore. And when identity stabilizes like that, life starts to feel more integrated. There's less tension between who we think we should be and who we actually are. We stop trying to chase an idealized version of ourselves and start embracing the person we're becoming in real time. That integration brings a sense of peace that doesn't depend on everything going perfectly. It comes from knowing we're anchored somewhere deeper than the moment we're in. When we zoom out and look at it all together, growth looks less like a dramatic transformation and more like a steady recentering. Our reactions don't control us the way they once did. Our priorities begin to align with what truly matters. Our identity becomes less fragile and more grounded. It's not flashy, but it's real, and it shows up in the texture of everyday life. So, if you've been wondering what it actually looks like when faith grows, it's this. It's the way we pause instead of react, recover faster. It's why what we chase begins to shift. It's the way we feel a little more grounded in who we are, even when life is still unpredictable. Growth doesn't usually announce itself with a big moment. It shows up quietly. Ordinary situations, small choices, and steady reshaping of how we live and move, respond. And sometimes, the only way we recognize it is by looking back and realizing we're not the same person we were, even if the change happens slowly. So, if this episode helped you notice some of those shifts in your own life, that's the whole point of these conversations. Putting language to what's happening so we can see it more clearly and keep moving forward with intention. And if you want to explore more, everything connected to the space lives in the show notes. That's where the whole ecosystem is. The resources, the next steps, the Start Here guide, the website, the books, if you're new or just want a clear place to go deeper. So thanks for sitting in this with me, and we'll talk again soon.